At every table, you have the emerging environmental leaders that were selected through a competitive process. We have tried to gather here the past, the present, and the future.
We will not change things unless we are passionately convinced that we need to do something about that.
The meeting's agenda is to take stock and inspire a new environmental leadership.
To be a leader, you have to be uncomfortable with the status quo.
As far as leadership goes, I think it's easy to be a leader, but I don't think it's easy to be a sustained leader.
It is recognizing differences. It's recognizing contestation in terms of the interests. It's recognizing conflict. But at the end of the day, looking at the convergence points, knowing that there are those areas we can work together despite the differences.
I believe that we have access to all of the tools and technologies now to build social networks, build social movements, give people access to transparent and current information that they didn't have access to 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago when they were working on these things.
There's a strong concern that the dominant institutions for what we're calling global environmental governance have become a bit too inward-looking, have become a bit too bureaucratic, a bit too encrusted. The people working in these institutions have become too much of a tight circle.
Political power is so important. Either we train the future political leaders to understand this issue, or we train the environmental leaders and make them into these critical positions so that in future, when they execute their mandate, they will always bring in these environmental elements.
Welcome all of you here to this historic segment of the Global Environmental Governance Forum.
And for the first time, all the past executive directors of UNEP were lined up on a panel to reflect on the past and peer into the future.
The very first one is, what is it that member states want? Do they want an organization that is a sustainable development organization, or do they want an organization that is an environmental organization with the responsibility for making environmental input into the broader sustainable development question?
That the current economic crisis and the environmental crisis, most not exclusively confined to the climate change crisis, but of which that is the main manifestation. These actually have their roots in the same things. They are not separate and competing issues. They both have their roots in the fact that our own economy is simply not workable.
I suggest that this distinguished group bring back to the distinguished governments of the world the principles they themselves declared since 1972. Go back to the Stockholm Conference, to the Rio Conference, to the Nairobi Conference in 1997, Millennium Development Goals, 2002 Johannesburg Principles. What did they implement out of these lofty words? None.
The green economy has arrived. The question is, will those who, in a sense, have a vested interest in the current economy, in the current energy infrastructure, in the current transport system, because they've invested in it, they've chosen certain technologies, they've anticipated certain markets, will we allow them to hold us back from a future where our jobs of tomorrow, where our markets of tomorrow, where our livelihoods of tomorrow are going to come from?
I went around the world and met with each of the executive directors for my own research on why UNEP has performed, why it has had challenges. And when I met with each and every one individually, in Cairo, in Beijing, in Toronto, each and every one was convinced that it would be useful for them to come together and pass on the wisdom, but also learn from each other.
But even with such a rich history, the nearly 40 years of UNEP's existence have hardly turned the tide on environmental degradation. And now many scholars and environmental leaders believe it's time for a rethink.
We've been doing this now for 40 years, and yet what we've seen, unfortunately, is that the environmental situation has continued to deteriorate and continued to deteriorate rapidly. So I think we have to ask, why is this happening? I mean, how could we be doing all the things that we think need to be done and we're still losing? And in fact, we're losing so much that we're really on the verge of ruining the planet, quite literally.
Indeed, the failure by the Copenhagen summit to agree on a new climate deal exemplified the growing crisis of governance at the international level and the failure of existing institutions to stem the tide.
What we need is to advance transformative principle in a managed way, and this is what I would simply call radical incrementalism. It's radical in the sense that, okay, we are moving certain pillars and redefining them, okay? It's incremental in the sense that we take one block at a time, because otherwise we will produce simple chaos.
We need to rethink the environmental governance structure. We need to think about the platforms in the United Nations system that allow countries to cooperate with one another on these issues. Because in the year 2012, the world will meet 20 years after the Rio Earth Summit, again in Rio, to review whether it has succeeded in the objectives that it laid out then. And clearly the role of the UN, and within it the role of the United Nations Environment Programme, will be one of the central questions.
The growing search for an effective governance formula has coincided with a wobbly global economy, and now many believe that the changes required will have to start with the very manner in which that economy is structured.
We're in a system which forces us to overcompromise with economic priorities, with the growth priority, over and over again. And basically, for those of us who are in the rich countries and the affluent countries, it's time to get away from this model that always prioritizes economic growth over everything else.
For these trailblazers, it has been down to the basics of life, such as seizing the moment.
If you get an opportunity to move on some environmental problem, move quickly and move decisively and move in a way that doesn't brook for any resistance.
Sheer tenacity.
But I have patience, and I believe that a lot can be accomplished over time. I know how to listen to people and get their ideas and suggestions, and I try to be less arrogant than most Americans. So that's the three principles that have helped me going.
Faith in a new generation.
It is absolutely wonderful to see that a younger generation is now inheriting all the mess which we created, but is absolutely capable, and I am 100% convinced that the young generation is capable to clean up the mess which we created.
And never giving up.
I am now 80 years old, but I'm still going, and as long as I go, I'm going to do my best to make sure that all the people in the world have a secure future.
And that message is hitting home.
I commit to leading by example.
I commit to work with the Aspen Institute to bring attention to the need for accountability for all of the nations to own up to their commitments in international environmental governance.
I commit to do research on global environment governance and China's participation.
My commitment is to ensure that the institutions for global environmental governance are made available and accessible to the underprivileged communities in Vietnam.
I will link the global debate on international environmental governance with the local level.
I commit to nurture young social workers to create an environmentally just society.